Welcome to the Bible Passages Podcast.
I said it was dangerous to get into world politics, but I think we've got all our facts lined out now.
Located west of Syria and Lebanon, the island of Cyprus is a divided country separated by a United Nations-controlled buffer zone.
Or a lot of these places to go to, especially the ones on the coast, are very desirable locations to go to just in general.
In the New Testament era, it had the distinction of being the first place where Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark preached the gospel on their first missionary journey.
I think Cyprus became a strategic location for Barnabas.
Today, Cyprus is known for its famous beaches and its extensive archaeological park, which houses the tombs of the kings and many Roman ruins.
Tomb of the Kings sells tickets a lot better than Tomb of the Unnamed Moderately Wealthy.
We hope you'll join us on this faith-building journey as we consider the many connections between faith and fact in the land of the Bible.
Hey, John, how's it going today?
Hey, Brian, doing great. Off to a good start today. And how about you? What's going on with you in your life?
Oh, nothing much. Very nice and pleasant day in Colorado. It is early December here, and it's almost 60 degrees, so that's a kind of a rarity. But
no way. Yeah.
If there wasn't any snow, or if the snow was all gone, I should be playing golf. But no, none of that today.
Yeah. Well,
what about you? How are things in Texas?
Oh, great. Just got through with Thanksgiving and gained a pound or two, unfortunately. So I got to try to get that off before Christmas, and because I do plan to eat during that time. But yeah, everything's going. Carla had a get together last night with the ladies from the local congregation and Christmas party over at our house here. So that meant that I got away to see a movie that I've been wanting to see on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And it's funny, when I went to buy some popcorn, okay, confession time, I got a big thing of popcorn. No butter though, just popcorn. And so it was like, of course, it's Monday night. There's nobody around, and I'm like, there's like three other people. There were only three other people in the theater that when I went to see it. But anyway, I buy my popcorn, and this guy says, "So what movie are you going to see?" And, "Oh, I'm going to see Bonhoeffer." And he goes, "Oh yeah, I heard a little bit about that, and I heard it was okay." And I said, "Yeah." I said, but it's a true story, and it's a fascinating one. He goes, "Oh, it's a true story? No way? Are you kidding me?"
Man.
And he didn't have any idea about really who he was or the situation. And so that was really sad, but it is a great story of courage and conviction during the time that Nazi Germany was ruling over over Germany and, big parts of Europe. And remember, of course, what happened is that they took control of the state church. And so he, as a Lutheran pastor, basically was being tempted to acquiesce like so many others had done, and it's kind of a sad situation. But anyway, won't get the whole storyline on. But some of his books, what he's written, has really, I think, influenced a lot of people in the way they think. His book on the cost of discipleship is one of them. But yeah, so anyway, went far too long on that, but wanted you to know about it.
Well, long story short, where's the official Bible Passages recommendation?
Where is it?
Yeah, like, should we go see it, or is it not worth seeing?
Oh yeah, definitely go see it. Definitely go see it. I think there are a lot of talking points in terms of just ethics and values, and just as far as a people of any nation, what happens when you don't speak up. And there's a classic line in that particular movie about I don't know that Bonhoeffer said it. I can't remember who said it, but I've seen it quoted. Actually, the first time I saw it was at the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And basically it was someone saying, they came for the socialists, but I didn't resist and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a socialist, right? And then they came for people in this political party and that political party, and they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And then when they came to take me, there was no one else to speak up, right? So his point is that we got to speak up for what's right, regardless of whether or not it affects us personally, and to speak on the liberties and the rights of others. And, anyway, there's just a great lesson on courage and especially in the face of a government that is oppressive to people and just doing things that are just obviously morally reprehensible. And it was what was going on there. But I could talk all day about that and the implications of that and the importance of that. And then, um, just the fact of the production value of that whole movie was very interesting. It was good. So anyway, enough of that.
Well, I mean, it's a good movie. I do plan to go see it. I do want to make one more very quick side trip because you mentioned it. One of the places we go when we travel to Israel is Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust museum that is in Jerusalem. There's not a direct Bible connection like there is other places. That is a modern event, but a powerful one. One that it's weird to say you can't wait to go back. I mean, I really enjoyed that experience, but it's a sobering day, and we do have some tours that'll be going in 2026, Lord willing, and it'll be good to go back to Yad Vashem and see some of the things, the way
Mhm.
that people navigated their way through that terrible time in history.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I do mention, by the way, when we're there is just the philosophical perspective of if we reject a objective standard of morality and truth, then what are we going to appeal to for determining right and wrong, and to even make a judgment against someone like Adolf Hitler, who and his cronies, who did what they said was according to the rule of law in their nation, and that was the appeal that they made at the Nuremberg trials, and yet the prosecutors said no. We appeal to a higher law, one that transcends the provincial and the transient. So anyway, we do make that moral, biblical connection in that regard. But yeah, you're right. There's no Bible land, connection there. But anyway, so great
Well,
stuff.
and as we get into, we're going to be talking about Cyprus here in just a second, but Y- by way of segue, and also to say one more thing, I mean, the Bible is not isolated to the first century. I mean, there are people in the second, third. We've talked about church history, we've talked about things like that, but there are even people in our own time, in our own setting, World War II, and in Vietnam and Korea, and all these things. Even the wars of today, Ukraine and in Israel itself, where people need to put their faith into practice in terms of what are they convicted about and what do they think. And we're going to talk about Cyprus. There's some ancient things that happened in Cyprus, but even there's some modern things that are going on in Cyprus now. So let's head that way. Let's talk about Cyprus. So Cyprus is an island in the Mediterranean, and it's often, in my own mind at least, confused with Crete, because they both start with C and they're both in the Mediterranean.
Mhm.
But that is right about where the similarities stop. Cyprus is, if you think about the Mediterranean as a square, which is maybe not a great thing to do, but it is in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean. So as you head north out of Jerusalem, up the coast of Israel, ultimately the coastline will make a westerly turn, and it kind of makes an L shape right there. And off the coast of both Turkey, south of the coast of Turkey, and west of the coast of Israel, there is this island that sits there, Cyprus. And John, did you know it was the third largest island in the Mediterranean?
Well, you had said something about that the other day, and I didn't. I knew it was a sizable island, but compared to the rest of the world, I wasn't sure. But you're right; it's the third largest in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, it's behind Sicily and Sardinia.
Hmm.
And we were kind of talking about some modern things in the introduction. So just to kind of put ourselves in the modern context of Cyprus, one thing we don't always mention, John, maybe because we feel bad about it, or maybe because we feel good about it and don't want anyone to know, but all of these places that we go to, or a lot of these places to go to, especially the ones on the coasts, are very desirable locations to go to just in general. And Cyprus is no exception. There are some resorts there, there's some beaches there. People like to travel, but it is a nation divided right now. And nation divided is not quite right. It is a country or a piece of land that is in dispute between two countries. So I forgot to look at the exact date, but In
1974. Yep.
Okay, so 1974, Turkey.
That's all I know, by the way. Okay, no, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, John, give me the every bit of the history of
Yeah,
Turkey. And
it's a long history,
um,
but I'm sorry. Anyway, just go ahead.
no. That's because I had forgotten to look at the date. But 1974, Turkey takes over part of this island, and it's a we'll dangerously stray into world politics for a second. Everybody kind of decried it and denounced it and said that was no good. And Turkey kind of said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" And they said, "Nothing." And even the capital city, I believe, the major city right there, is divided right down the middle, and there's a line there. Fortunately, there's no animosity. Seemingly, I mean, there's rumblings and that kind of thing, but there's no violence or anything like that. Tourists are actually can easily cross between the two sides. Any more thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, I'm almost positive it is the Southern Republic of Turkey, and then of Turkey of Cyprus, and then the northern part. Even though Turkey is the one that with their troops, like 40,000 troops or something, invaded. I think they call themselves the National Republic of Northern Cyprus or something like that. So, but there's nobody else that recognizes them as a separate entity except Turkey. And then the southern part of that is like so Greece doesn't technically own the southern part. I think that they're their own basically republic as well, and because it all used to be one local republic or nation, and then in 1974 it divided. So, but definitely, if you think to the north, more Turkish Muslim influence; to the south, definitely more Greek, vast majority Greek in the south, with Greek Orthodox influence as the dominant religion. So yeah, definitely a country divided. But at one time they were one for a little short time in there when they got their independence from the British. Um, and then, but of course, they've had a long history where a lot of people wanted this land, and we can talk about that in just a moment. So yeah, it's there was a little bit of political unrest there for quite a while, and then but in recent years, it's kind of quieted down, and you can visit both sides. But I think most people kind of go to the south side. At least that's where the cruise ship lands. Where at Limassol, where we have landed on a cruise ship before, we're going to land there again this coming March, and to go to visit Paphos. Paphos.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that. And this is to correct where I misspoke and also be very clear. It's not that Turkey took over Cyprus, and it's not that Greece had it. You're exactly right. Cyprus was independent in 1960 when they gained independence from Britain.
Yep.
But there are Turkish sympathizers and there are Greece sympathizers, and they are divided among those lines. And when they
Yeah.
divided, you're exactly right. It is still country of there's a Republic of Cyprus, and then there's I have forgotten the northern name, um, but Turkey is the only country that recognizes the northern section as an independent country now.
Yep.
And again, I said it was dangerous to get into world politics, but I think we've got all our facts lined out now. So that's
Well, but maybe
exactly right.
that's a good segue to talk a little bit about why that island is so important as it connects to the Bible and so forth. But I do want to mention before we move on, geographically think about where that's located as sort of an important stopping off point between east and west. And as people are from the Roman Empire, they're going to take control of that island. We've got the Greeks who have control of it. The Persians at one time have control over it. So it goes back and forth, back and forth. The Muslims during the medieval period, the Muslim conquest, and then the Crusaders, they want it as well during the medieval period, because as you're traveling by boat, as you leave the areas of Greece, or coming from places in Europe, on the way down to the Bible lands, or particularly the so-called Holy Lands and the area of Palestine and Israel and all that, that's a stopping off point. And not only is it a stopping off point in terms of trade, as this sort of intersection out there in the middle of the Mediterranean, or at least a place where there are intersections going on there in terms of sailing, but there's also some natural resources there in terms of ore and other metal items that people are wanting. There's also pottery that's going to be made there that's going to be imported. I mentioned this the Cypriot ware that is the particular expensive pottery that was looked for at Jericho to determine the particular age of that city in connection to the fall of Jericho and whether or not it was found. Kathleen Kenyon, who was a British archaeologist, she was looking for that expensive ware that was an important identifier for a particular period came from Cyprus is what she was looking for. Of course, she was looking in the wrong area. That's a whole nother story. But my point is that particular Cypriot ware, you can hear the word Cyprus come from there, and there was pottery that was made in that area going back to the Mycenaean, Minoan civilizations and others. So, anyway, it's got a rich, rich history geographically and politically.
And you mentioned several of the, the Cypriot ware or the Cypriot. Again, I don't know which is the right pronunciation,
Yeah,
but
I probably got it wrong. Yeah.
well, no, you mentioned two things that I want to key in on. One is this island is important militarily as well as strategically for trade and whatnot. Modern equivalents to this would be like the United States has a base in Guam. Right? Well, we have a base in Guam because it's an island with strategic access. That's why China is very interested in Taiwan. It's why Russia is interested in the peninsula of Crimea. It's an area of strategic military access. And then the other thing you mentioned is the wares, and it's funny actually. The analogy that came to mind is Turkish. If anybody has had a really nice, fancy, expensive Turkish carpet, well, there's a way to distinguish those that came from Turkey and how they're made and all that nice kind of stuff. Well, the same way we would do that in someone's home, what John is talking about in Jericho happened, right? They knew of this really specific type of Cypriot wares, and they were looking for them, and they give an indication of how people traded and also dates and that kind of thing. So very, very interesting how an island can really be hallmarked. John, one of the go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to mention one other thing there. You're talking about bases. Actually, the United States, and I had to just look this up to make sure because I was thinking that they did and I wanted to verify it, but they do. In fact, the United States has a military presence in Cyprus. And, because it's an important launching point to be able to send jets over our army to, have a staging area to the Middle East. And so you think about the Romans wanting to be there, and the Persians wanting to be there again, because as I mentioned, it's sort of this halfway point. So, but that also says this, and maybe that's where we can kind of segue into the biblical part of this, where we really want to go, and that is that it is actually very close to the continent of Asia. It's very close to uh, Antioch of Syria, where Christians were first called, disciples were first called Christians in Antioch, Acts 11, verse 26. And that is only 130 miles from that area. So today, it's very close to all the stuff that's going on in the Middle East. It's not far away at all. So think about it from that perspective, 130 miles away.
Well, and I think since you mentioned that, it might be a good time to talk about sailing in ancient times or travel in ancient times. So southeastern, let me make sure I got that right. Yeah, southeastern Turkey, very mountainous, and so that's not uncommon. We've talked about other places in Greece. We've even talked about places in Israel. Mountains are not things you want to travel over for long periods of time. So, how is Paul going to get from Antioch in Syria over to Turkey, or even from Asia Minor, that area, Turkey, across to Greece, or anywhere else really with these large mountains? Well, to cross those mountains is going to be difficult. And so they're going to sail. And John, did you want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of sailing in that time, or
Yeah, well, let's. I think maybe if we could put this first of all in its biblical context, to remember that you've got, number one, Barnabas, who is actually from this area. Acts chapter 4 mentions that specifically, that he is from Cyprus. And then he comes over to Jerusalem, and he's there working in the church, and then ends up at Antioch. And then we've got a mention of Cyprus in Acts 11, verse 20, when the church is suffering and dealing with persecution um, in Samaria, Judea, and those places. And now the church begins to scatter, and the Bible specifically mentions in Acts 11:20 that they go to Cyprus. So there are Christians there, and we know there are Jews there, as we'll see in just a moment. But then we get to Acts 13, and to make the point of what you're saying about the sailing is that as Paul is at Antioch, he and Barnabas are there. Barnabas has taken Paul under his wings and worked with him there and introduced him to the church. And so as they work there, the church says, we want to send you guys out to establish congregations, to do the work of the ministry of the Lord, to preach to the Gentiles. And so in Acts 13, which officially begins this, what we call the so-called first missionary journey of Paul. The Bible doesn't call it the first missionary journey, but we tend to do it that way because they are these sort of concentrated efforts of going different places, and we've divided them into three like that because they're kind of easier to remember. But we know Paul went on missionary journeys even before this, as recorded in the book of Galatians, and then even mentioned in the book of Acts. But the first major attempt where they're sent out by a congregation, where there's a kind of an entourage of people going with him, is from Antioch, and they sail across from Seleucia, which is a port city of Antioch, of Syria. Just again, that's when you think about the coastline of going up from Caesarea, from the mainland of the Bible land area of Palestine that we would refer to today. The Romans called it that. And then going on up about, another 300 or 400 miles, you're going to run into Antioch, or to Syria. And then there, Antioch had that port city, Seleucia. And then you're going to go 130 miles over to Salamis, which is really the major port city of Cyprus. Now, sometimes the question comes, well, how long did it take for them to get there? Well, if a boat travels, on a good day with a lot of good winds, about 48 nautical miles per day, that's roughly about 41 miles. It's going to take them around 3 days to get there. So imagine Paul under the best circumstances, and Barnabas and John Mark here getting on this boat, and they're not traveling in the typical way that they might, sort of hugging the coastline where it's much safer. They're getting out into, a major portion of the Mediterranean Sea here, even though it's only 130 miles away on a smaller vessel. You think about how, daunting that was for them to do that and to make that journey. And I don't know about you, but I'm a little I get a little motion sickness. Do you? Do you? Do you have any
No,
trouble with that, Brian?
I have no issue with seasickness whatsoever. Car sickness, very little, but never had an issue with seasickness. I will say, so you remember last time we went to Cyprus, John mentioned it was by a cruise boat, and not just any cruise boat, but a massive ship operated by Royal Caribbean. And do you remember? I think it was the next to last day was the only day we even had a little bit of turbulence in the sea. And do you remember? Because I think you and Carla and Shannon and me got out of the side and were standing on the end where we could see the front of the ship, and it was crashing into those waves. And every now and again, it would hit
I'd forgotten
a
about
really
that.
big
Yeah.
one. Well, that was cool. It would have been a whole lot less cool if we would have been in a smaller vessel, because what we were in was very safe and secure and not too wasn't affected by that too much. But yeah, you mentioned the typical way that they sailed was down the coast, and that's because if you have an issue, you want to be able to swim to shore, or try to make land if you have an issue.
Well,
But
it's also to be able to navigate, right? Because
right,
when you get out in the open ocean, you can't. What are you going to do? By the stars, or what if it's cloudy and all that? But if you hug the coastline, then you've got promontories that you can navigate by and to keep you, going in the right direction. But yeah, but no, I mean you're right. I think about that a lot. Just think about the courage, the conviction, or just the I know there was some excitement to some degree about it, right? To get to go and to preach the gospel and to different places, but there also was a great deal of danger and trepidation involved in this.
yeah, and again, on a nice calm day, it seems like it'd be lots of fun. But on stormy days, I'm not sure it would be fun at all. Um,
Yeah.
we're going to go out of order. I don't know that we're going to talk too much about this later on, so I don't mind doing it now. But there is one more feature of sailing and geography that plays into a much different part of the Acts narrative. When Paul is sets out for Rome, he's appealed to Caesar and he's going to be taken to Rome. The Bible text talks about them sailing around Cyprus and around Crete as well. They would go around the southern end of those islands because the islands themselves act like a wind barrier. So if you've got northerly winds that are coming down and creating waves in the sea, they'll sail close and tight to the southern end of those islands to be able to try to mitigate that a little bit. Didn't seem to have any problem when they got to Cyprus, but when they tried to get around Crete that same way, they were obviously blown out to sea, and that was both by prophecy and God was clearly working in that situation. And then as they tried to make it to Rome, they were shipwrecked at Malta. So all of that to say, one, there is a mention of them sailing under Cyprus, but two, again, just to highlight the danger of what could really be an issue sailing in the Mediterranean in the
Mhm.
first century. And of course, even today, I don't know if I haven't heard a news story about it recently, but unfortunately, there have been a lot of people who have been trying to escape Africa and the issues that are going on there. And they'll try to get to the coast and they'll try to sail to Europe in makeshift rafts. And it's a very, very dangerous situation for them even today. So, all of that to say, it could have been exciting, but it could have also been very dangerous to sail in the first
Mhm.
century.
Yeah. So next time you're reading the Bible and you come to Acts 13, verse 4, and you read that they sailed to Cyprus, maybe think about that, look at a map, think about what we talked about, that 130 miles, 3 or 4 days at best. Some say it may have taken a week, depending upon the winds, to get there. And they finally arrived now to Salamis, which I've not been to Salamis. We've only been to Paphos there and Paphos and traveled through Cyprus there, but there is some evidence of some things that are there. You want to mention a couple of things or anything come to mind about what's there?
Well, I think the biggest thing, obviously, they land there. In the modern country of Cyprus, this is one of their largest, if not the largest, cities on the island. So there's still a large draw for trade and all the things we talked about in the introduction. There is, and you mentioned this, but there is a connection to Barnabas. Says that Barnabas was a Levite from Cyprus, and because of that connection to Barnabas, um, two kind of interesting things. One, I don't know that I ever really considered how their travel may have been impacted by this, but I think Cyprus became a strategic location for Barnabas. So they obviously go there immediately after Antioch. So that would have been home turf, for lack of a better term, for Barnabas and where they were going. He would have probably had some contacts there. He probably would have been able to talk to some people he knew. But then after um, John Mark and Paul and Barnabas split, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, Barnabas takes John Mark back to Cyprus, and again, that's kind of like going home in a good way, probably. Let's go back to a place where we're familiar. Let's go back to a place where we can have some support and that kind of thing. So I don't know that it makes much of a connection, but I don't know that I ever realized Barnabas was going home every time he went to Cyprus. Um, and because of that, there is some connection between Barnabas and Cyprus that persists through church history. There is a record, and we've talked about uh, how accurate some of the or some of the traditions about biblical things can be, but there is a church tradition that says Barnabas was ultimately martyred at Salamis, and that is written in it's non-canonical. It's a book called Acts of Barnabas,
Mhm.
a pseudepigraphal work, but there is some tie that Barnabas has to this island. So the Bible confirms all the things we said about him being from there, and then the tradition is that he ultimately met his demise there. So, John, did you find anything else besides
No,
that on
just
Salamis?
that if you go there today, that there are some Roman ruins, the typical Stoa, things that we've talked about in other sessions. So there are some evidences of that, and then some traditional sites associated with the Christian faith, as you'd mentioned, and in particular to Barnabas. Um, but yeah, so the text then, I mean, and in fact, the Bible says that they arrived there and they proclaimed the word of God. How long did they stay there? We don't know. They could have stayed there weeks and weeks and weeks. That he just preached one sermon and move on. That's not typically what Paul does, right? He's usually there for a little while preaching, but let's just say he was there a few days, and then John Mark is there to assist him. Is that when John first encounters some issues, or is it a little later on, as we're going to see here, some things that he runs into? But then the Bible says that they go over, and this is where we may want to shift gears now a little bit and talking about Paphos, because that's where a fascinating event occurs, and where there's some more archaeological things and some sites that you can see when you go to visit there today. But I do want to mention this just to kind of tack on to get that experiential element of this. This is from Salamis to Paphos is basically 125 miles. Okay. Um, and Brian, I'm just thinking about how long would it take for Paul to walk from there, from Salamis to Paphos? Well, how many miles do you think you could walk in an hour?
In an hour,
Yeah.
the average person hikes at 3 miles an hour, and
Okay.
that's what I'm going with.
Yeah. Okay, and that's about right. I mean, I think about this a lot. My house, basically, where Carla and I live in Dripping Springs, is 3 miles down to the center part of town. The reason I know that is because when I lived here when I was in high school, I thought, okay, I'm going to get in shape for football, and I'm going to run from our house down there in the morning and back, and so I found out that's exactly 3 miles. And well, I ended up walking most of it, not running that first day. So it took about an hour, right? And since then, I found out that's about typical. Just that's exactly right. So that's what I think of. So, based on that, it would have taken him maybe if he's walking about 8 hours a day, and I kind of nonstop, which I kind of doubt, right? You would have stopped and maybe talked to people, or would have maybe had time to eat or whatever. But maybe it was a full out walk. But let's just say that it was 8 hours a day. It's going to take him about 4 to 5 days of walking to get from Salamis to Paphos. So that's just one example of the kinds of things that Paul did, and Barnabas and others, to take the gospel to where. How many of us go very far from where we even live today to take the gospel somewhere, right? I mean, we may go on vacation, but are we going to really travel very far? And as one preacher and friend of mine used to say, we don't even walk across the street. We won't even walk to our neighbor hardly to do it. I think about my grandmother, who uh, was born and reared in Dripping Springs, and the furthest she ever got in her entire life, and this would have been she died in around 19 mid 1980s, and the furthest that she ever got away from her home was in San Antonio, Texas, which is only an hour to the south. Wow, that's it in her entire life. And so people, in that day and age, even though the Romans had a lot of roads and there was a great deal of trade and commerce, the average person did not travel very far away from where they were born. Okay. And so to think of someone like Paul and these early Christians being dedicated to get on a ship, then to go to Salamis, and then to walk 125 miles down to Paphos to preach the gospel there is quite remarkable. So when they get there, let's talk a little bit about that, what the Bible says quickly, and then is there anything there today that we might connect to the site or to
Yeah.
the story?
So, well, and all good stuff. So when they got there, and the if you're reading Acts 13, the majority of what happens on Cyprus seems to happen right here in Paphos. And so when they get there, we're introduced to two people. We're introduced to Sergius Paulus. And we'll talk about him in just a second, and then a Jewish Jewish magician. How am I going to say the Greek words, John, if I can't even say the English words? Whose Greek name or translation of his name was Elymas, or his
I'd say Elymas, but that's just another element. Anyway,
right,
yeah.
Elymas. His Jewish name was Bar Jesus. So this man is a Jewish magician. John, before I go any further, I actually want to have a conversation here. Do you find it fascinating that this Roman and this Jew got along the way they did? Did
Yeah,
you
I mean,
stop to think about that?
yeah, I mean, I kind of wanted that too on a couple of levels. Is that it has happened in Scripture? Remember the centurion in Capernaum, right? That he loved our nation. So there are examples of that, and we may have mentioned in previous episodes about Philo mentioning the Jewish philosopher of Alexandria, that the Jews actually had a fairly significant impact upon the Mediterranean world in a lot of places. There was a great deal of respect, I think, for the way that they lived their life, for the religious fervor that they had. Not all of them, of course, on either side of that, but still, how is it and why is it that this Jewish man got connected to a very, very powerful person within the Roman Empire, right? A proconsul here. He's in charge of this province. That's a high position in the Roman Empire. I don't know. I wonder. Was it because of money? Was it because of his that this Jewish man brought something educationally to him? In fact, what does the text say about Sergius Paulus? He was a man of intelligence, and there are some historical documents suggesting that a man with this name, actually composed and wrote some things that we don't have surviving today, but other writers of this period spoke about a man by the name of Paulus, Sergius Paulus, that wrote things. Is this the same guy? Could be. So maybe that's a connection. Do you ever thought about that, Brian? What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think I do find it really interesting that it calls him a magician and a Jewish false prophet. I think a little bit about the relationship between Caiaphas, the high priest, and his was it his father-in-law or his brother-in-law, and the relationship that they shared with Rome. Um, Obviously, there were certain Roman or certain Jewish religious leaders that figured out if they got in good with Rome and did what Rome wanted to do, they could live a certain lifestyle. I wonder, if this guy had some sort of ability to maybe deceive, or even maybe kind of like the people we talked about in Ephesus last week, if they actually had some sort of ability to um, interact with unclean spirits. It's unclear, but it's interesting, and a little bit fun to speculate about how they could have come to be friends. But one way or another, they have this relationship, and it's clear that the relationship is not um, one based on just pure, honest friendship. It's a relationship that had to do with money and had to do with the position that Bar Jesus is going to have and the influence that he has. And we know that because what happens is they get there is Paul is teaching Sergius Paulus the way, or he's heard the preaching, he's heard what's going on, and Bar Jesus sees this as a threat, clearly going to put him in a maybe out on the street corner, as we say. It'll leave him high and dry or out in the cold.
Well, and let me interject something here real quick while you're thinking about that, and that is, we read that word magician, and what do we think of? We think of someone who's an illusionist, right? And that's not typically what is meant here. It's more of like it comes from a word from which the magi from the east when they saw the star. All right, so these are people who discerned um, the things in the natural world. They were to some degree, from different, I guess they would go to different perspectives on this. Maybe some who were so dependent on astrology, others who were just trying to discern the natural world and what it meant and all of that. So I kind of tend to think of it as that, here is a guy that definitely had some knowledge and understanding of the world, maybe of the Eastern religions, and sort of brought that together with Judaism to some degree. We do know that has happened, um, even, and I can't think of the name of the style of Jewish religion now that's very much interested in the occult. But I'll think of it in a second. But anyway, so go ahead.
Well, and there, like you're saying, there was like a Jewish mysticism, and there was a
Kabbalah. Sorry,
yeah.
Kabbalah.
There you go.
Yeah,
um, well, to make a not so long story short,
it's too late for
the
that.
yeah, Paul says it was filled with the Holy Spirit, clearly denounced Bar Jesus, and then um, he is ultimately struck blind for a time, and that event caused the proconsul to believe, and it says that he was astonished, not that Bar Jesus was blind. It says that he was astonished at the teaching of the Lord. So I don't know about you, John, but if I saw somebody be struck blind, I think I'd be astonished by the event. But the text is pretty clear to say that the proconsul is interested in what Paul had to say more than he was interested in what Paul was able to do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk about what's there then. Is there anything at the site that might, or from archaeology that we can connect to the text here?
Yes. So Paphos is what we're talking about, and there is a new Paphos and an old Paphos, and then there's a modern Paphos. Um, so keeping somewhat straight what we're talking about, we're going to be talking largely about the old city of Paphos, the ancient one. Um, I think the coolest thing that is there, and the one that I'm most excited to talk about, is the Tomb of the Kings. Um, Interestingly, I don't believe that there's any kings that were buried there. At least there's been no record of kings who were buried there. The Tomb of the Kings is an elaborate burial place, probably wealthy families, and it is very, very cool. And John, it lets you and me do something that we like to do, and that's crawl around in ancient spaces and see what's there. Do you remember crawling around in the Tomb of the Kings?
Yeah, I mean, it's this. I mean, when you think about Paphos and this old, the old biblical site, it's a large archaeological site, and then about a mile away from where the main town is, and some of the things we'll talk about in a minute, or even maybe a little bit less than a mile, there is this burial site, and this burial site was obviously reserved for the more prominent, wealthier families in this well-to-do area. I mean, there's some indication that from those tombs and from some things we'll talk about at the archaeological site associated with the city, that there was quite a bit of wealth here and opulence. And so maybe, and I know there's a lot of debate about why you have all of these tombs built, carved into these rocks down deep that are so elaborate and so beautiful. Was it their belief about having a luxurious place for them to sort of reside for the afterworld, to have the things that they needed, like the Egyptians? Was it a way to honor them? I think there's a lot of things still to be interpreted, but it is really cool to walk around in, um, even though there's no, obvious biblical connection that we can see, other than making some connections about the resurrection of the body and things like that. But still, yeah, it was. Was there something there that you stood out in your mind when you were crawling around in those tombs?
Well, the two things. One, the shot of the Tomb of the Kings. It's kind of hard to talk about. You actually walk what would be over them, and you go down into them. So the walking level, or the sky level, where whatever I'm trying to say here, ground level, is actually the roof of these, and you walk down into them. But if you just Google a picture of these, or maybe we'll put a picture on the show notes, there's a big square hole in the ground, and that roof of that structure is held up with columns, and so it very much looks like this very ornate building that's built right into the ground. And when you go down in it, you can kind of peer in and out of those columns. And they're also connected underground, so you can kind of go from room to room and go through over rocks and through holes in the wall and upstairs. So just kind of a neat place
They're
to
very
look
rocky and
around.
jagged, wouldn't you say? I mean, it is. It's not
Yeah.
for the faint of heart. It's and once you
Well,
get
and
in
I,
there, I mean, it's. Go ahead.
um, well, just quick side trip to, you remember the tower in Nebi Samuel?
Yep,
Um,
in Israel.
there was no ancient code for stairs. um, Pretty much they just cut them whichever way they were feeling on a particular day. Nebi Samuel is a place where you can go up in a tower, and I don't know how old the steps are there. They're not ancient, but they were also not to code, and I remember them being pretty harrowing. And I connect those two things in my mind because, like I said, when they built these steps, it was just kind of like, oh, here looks like a place wide enough for my foot, and that's a whole step. And it is kind of interesting to get down there, but not too bad. But definitely
Yeah.
not your. There's no ramps down there or anything like that.
Well, and let me say that you mentioned it, but maybe people are wondering, well, why then do they call it the Tomb of the Kings if no kings have been found there? And it's kind of one of those things. I think when people were first discovering them, they automatically assumed, because of the elaborate nature of them, and especially maybe in connection to on a much smaller version as far as the size of them, perhaps, than the pyramids. But still, I think maybe at first they're thinking, well, this must be a royal burial site. So, as with so many things in the archaeological world, or I should say, in the world of tourism, and in the local, city chamber of commerce, of trade tourism, whenever they come across something and they automatically give it a name, oh, this must be it, then the name sticks and people use that for forever. And it sounds intriguing. I know the first time I saw that, Tomb of the Kings, wow, this has got to be awesome. And then you get there and you find out, well, there's no evidence of any kings in there, but it is still pretty awesome just to take a visit into that and to see the elaborate nature of these tombs, what the extent to what people went through to bury their dead, and why did they do that? Looking and examining the material remains of an ancient culture um, is mysterious, and it's exciting because you're trying to piece together the ancient past. What did they believe about the afterlife? Why did they believe it? Have we discerned it correctly? And one thing is for sure, you can connect the past to the present, Brian, and remember that all of us, even today, think about the same things, right? When we think about burying our loved ones, we don't maybe today have elaborate tombs for every family member, but the wealthier will have a huge, big monument sometimes, a larger tombstone, or we feel like, oh, I've got to put something at their graveside that really signifies that we're honoring them in some way, that we haven't forgotten them. Well, they did sort of the same thing, especially the wealthier.
Well, and you make a good point. Tomb of the Kings sells tickets a lot better than Tomb of the Unnamed Moderately Wealthy.
Yeah, right.
Uh,
That's good. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so but a cool place. And then the next place I want to talk about is a place that's called Paul's Pillar. Um, and you actually might have to help me remind me where that is in relation to Tomb of the Kings. Did we walk or did we get on a bus? I
No, we
forgot.
got on a bus. It's kind of more in the newer part, the more modern part, surrounded by some modern buildings, but it's not far. I mean, it's all within, 5-10 minutes of a bus drive of each other, all these sites. Yeah.
Well, and so once again, Paul's Pillar, the gold star goes to the advertiser more than it goes to the actual event. What we're looking at, there's a place with some remains that are in an area, and there's a walkway, and you can kind of walk around, and there's some standing pillars, and there's a lot of pillars that are fallen over, and there used to be several buildings there. Truth be told, there's not a ton right there. There's a very, very late Byzantine church that takes up part of the courtyard, and it's called Paul's Pillar because there is again a tradition that Paul was scourged right there at that pillar, or beaten, or
Mhm.
punished. They would attach him to the pillar and punish him there.
And it's
Um,
right in the middle of an archaeological site that does date to the Roman period, and that's why they're making that connection because, as you said, there's that big old Byzantine church building. It's not hugely old, but still, but all around it is a archaeological site that has not been really rebuilt or reconstructed to the full extent. But you've got some of these what probably was a part of an old column that was used, or maybe they erected it for that, and so a tradition gets started. But yeah.
right, and exactly. I mean, exactly what you're talking about. There's Roman stuff there, and then there's the pillar, I guess, as they call it. I don't know if you remember, but in my mind's eye, there's one that's like nice and tall and sits right next to it, and then there's this little short stubby thing. It's the stubby one, or the shorter one, that is so called Paul's Pillar. And I've beat around the bush long enough. I don't think there's any evidence of any kind that links that pillar to Paul. John, you've mentioned the only evidence, and that is it's in this site that was Roman, that would have been about the time that Paul was there, and I think that's as close as we can get.
Yeah. There's a passage that some of the local tour guides or maybe some church groups do recite when they go out there, and that's from 2 Corinthians 11. And there's a kind of a long standing uh, Orthodox tradition associated with this site from 2 Corinthians 11, where Paul speaks about his having been beaten 3 times. I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned. And for some reason, this tradition is associated with all three of those beatings taking place there. So while though there is absolutely no evidence for that being a stone that he was actually tied up to and beaten, it's still sobering, isn't it? To think about. It's a great place to go and to think, well, Paul did come here and he preached. He was persecuted at times. We do know, again, tradition, as you've mentioned, of Barnabas being uh, martyred here, or at least at Cyprus. And now to think of a place like this, of Christians actually having been beaten, like Paul was, for preaching the gospel, to try to curtail his efforts. Maybe this will sort of thwart his desire to preach, but he kept on doing it despite everything that had happened to him in his life. And man, that's a powerful lesson for us today, to think about. We don't endure nearly what Paul did in terms of his travel, in terms of the experiences, the persecution, the ridicule, and yet Paul considered it an honor to preach the gospel, right?
Well, and I want to go right back to that. Just I feel like we need to make a very quick mention of just one other thing. So we talked about the Tomb of the Kings. We talked about Paul's Pillar. The other major site there, although there's a house of Theseus, which could also be called the governor's palace. There's an Asclepion, which when you hear that word, think hospital, although not quite the same thing. It was a place of healing. There's an Odeon, or Odeon, we've talked about that in other places, which is like a small um, amphitheater where they did plays and that kind of thing. But the major other feature there is what's called the House of Dionysus, or Dionysus, however you want to say that. It's called that because of the mosaics that were inside. Dionysus is a Greek god. The Roman god is Bacchus. It's a god of wine and partying and festivals and that kind of thing. There are several 100 feet of mosaics in this house, and maybe I'll put a picture in the show notes. But I I don't have much more to say about that other than that's the other thing to be seen there. John, do you want to add any more things before we get back to what you were talking
Yeah, I
about
do
with
want
the
to say
connection?
something about the
Yeah.
the house of Theseus, and and that is, this mythological figure in Greek history that killed the Minotaur at Crete. And the reason that this house that they have identified as the governor's house or the proconsul's house is called this is because there is a beautiful mosaic with a depiction of him there, and so that's why it got its name. But what is important about this site, and I think when you go there, you need to read Acts 13 and this event, because if this was the place where Sergius Paulus lived, then you're standing at the site where Paul preached the gospel to him. Now, this place is huge. It's a big residence for an important official with lots of rooms for festivities and for feast and for lodging and courtyard areas and all of that, fit for a person who was of the position that Sergius Paulus was. So when you go there, think about this. There is a place located here that we know is the site of the administrative center of Cyprus, where the proconsul lived for the Roman Empire. That's exactly what the Bible says, right? When you read about these things, and then I know you're going to want to mention the Sergius Paulus inscription here in just a moment, but when you go to these places, this is what is so awesome. This is not fairy tale. When you read in the Bible, it's not mythological. It didn't take place in a land, in a galaxy far away. These are real places, real people. And so you're walking in and through uh, the annals of history. You're walking in the steps of the Apostle Paul. Now, I know that building, the House of Theseus, is a second century AD building, but pretty much everybody says that there is all the evidence that it was built on top of buildings that were administrative buildings and palatial like structures going back to the Greek period. So it had a long-standing period, which makes sense that you're going to build where it was before, the great ocean view, and the area where it was to build upon and expand it and all of that. So if you're walking through for sure second century, then 100 years before that, easily, this is the place where the Apostle Paul stood before Sergius Paulus and preached him the gospel. And this most significant, very significant person of the Roman Empire believes. He becomes a believer. And it's just a reminder of the gospel penetrates various echelons of society, socioeconomic levels of people, different races of people, religions, because it reminds us that we're all sinners, and it reminds us that there is one true God who loves us and wants to be in fellowship with us. So, very powerful, especially given you mentioned Asclepius, you've got paganism there, and we haven't mentioned Aphrodite, that this is the birthplace, right? The legendary birthplace Cyprus is of Aphrodite, and the weird how that she was born in the ocean there. I won't go into all of the gruesome, or I should say profane things about how she came into being there in the ocean and then washed up basically, and this is her birth site. But she's honored and worshipped here. So these gods, these pagan gods that are aloof, that uh, seem so foreign and different in many ways, yet this God of heaven and that Paul preaches about, brings hope and peace and gives understanding to a man who is of intelligence, who's wanting to know the facts and information. So, Brian, talk to us a little bit about this most made. We probably ought to spend the whole time talking about the Sergius Paulus inscription, but go ahead.
Well, and I think I have made up my mind on the spot that that might have to be maybe an Image
Oh
Insight
no, you
or
can't.
an article. We'll tease some of that. I do want to talk about it just briefly.
Yeah, okay. I thought you were
So
going to bypass it there for a second.
no, I will. I have to. I think we have to mention it, but I won't go into all the gory details. But there are actually several inscriptions with the name Sergius Paulus on it, and it would be the equivalent of uh, giving somebody's maybe first and last name and leaving out the middle, and we're kind of confused as who that is. Maybe their name was. Well, I give you actually a great example. Joseph Smith. If I said that, then you're probably thinking, okay, the guy who found the golden tablets and founder of Mormonism and that kind of thing. Well, I may be talking about Joseph Smith, the guy that goes to Bear Valley that we worship with. His full name is Joe Mott Smith, but his name is Joseph Smith. The same thing happened in Rome. Sergius Paulus is missing actually what they call the prenomen, so the first name. So we really only get his nomen and his cognomen, and again, that's where the article will come in. But they have found a Sergius Paulus proconsul inscription in Cyprus, but they've also found references to him in other places. And John alluded to the idea that he may even have been someone who wrote some literature and some other places. So, just a brief mention of that because I want to talk about the connections to what John was talking about a second ago. But do you want to add anything to the Sergius Paulus inscription?
Yeah, just so that we're clear, is that um, there is a Paulus inscription with proconsul name on it, and then you've got another inscription with Sergius Paulus, and then you've got one that is mentioned, and it doesn't have anything to do with any kind of a Roman title, but then you've got a Sergius Paulus inscription found connected with Rome and to the banks of the Tiber River who administrated it. So, in other words, it's sort of connecting all the dots to be able to figure out that probably his first name was Lucius. And we won't go into that into an article, but what's the point of it? The point of it is this: is that the Bible mentions a man in this area that we can connect the dots to with that title, proconsul, and then putting all the inscriptions together, you can say, yes, Sergius Paulus, the proconsul here in this area, just like the Bible says.
And like I said, I think we'll get an article or maybe a video about that. I really enjoyed reading about that in preparation for this episode. I want to talk with our time remaining about the last thing that we read about this account in Acts 13. After they leave Paphos, it says that John Mark in verse 13 of Acts 13 left and returned to Jerusalem. Um, and that may seem insignificant at the face, but there seems to be some indication that Paul did not take kindly to what happened, or maybe he felt abandoned or left, or maybe he thought that John Mark did not have the fortitude to carry on. But all the things that John has mentioned, all the things you've mentioned all the way through this podcast, how hard it would have been to sail, how long they had to walk, that could have all played a part into his decision. What about the events that happened? This man is struck blind. I don't imagine that there was just a nice friendly conversation and this happened. There might have been some yelling, some conflict, some unfortunate things that happened. For whatever reason, though, John Mark does not make it past this point in the journey. Whatever happened between Antioch and Cyprus, or really their next stop where they ended up, is not sitting well with him. And I think, John, you've brought up the point all throughout the podcast. How much are we willing to endure for our faith? And part of that is tough because I don't have to endure that much. You know, I there was an issue getting to school this morning, so it took me an hour and 10 minutes to go what should only take me about 40. And boy, that was frustrating. But I didn't have to walk. I sat in my nice heated car for an extra 20 minutes. We live in such ease and such comfort that our fortitude has not really ever been tested. And that's not true for everybody in the world. Lots of people, hopefully, listening to our podcast can find encouragement knowing that they followed in those steps of Paul. But for the average American Christian, our fortitude has not been tested. Are we willing to go to the lengths that Paul was willing to go to? Are we willing to follow in his footsteps as he followed in Christ's footsteps? John, do you want to add anything to that idea?
I think also there is the lesson of redemption, and that God, through people, by the way, helps to bring about the whole concept of redemption. That is, when maybe we make a bad decision, we do some things that other people don't agree with or don't like. Um, God ultimately makes good out of it, because remember what Barnabas did was he then said, "Okay, I want to take John Mark with me," because when there was a disagreement later on between Paul and Barnabas, when they got ready to go on their second journey, it seems like John Mark, had said, "Okay, I want to go," but Paul said, "No, we're not going to take him with us," because he turned back. But so Paul and Barnabas had a disagreement about it, but Barnabas saw something in John Mark, and whatever the reason was for his turning back, let's just assume that it was a bad thing, that he lacked courage or conviction or whatever it was. Barnabas didn't hold that against him. He didn't hold that over his head. But in fact, he saw the good in him, and he recognized his strengths as opposed to his weaknesses. And then he helped to, develop him and to mentor him. And so much so that later on, Paul is going to say, "John Mark, send him. He's profitable unto me now." So Barnabas, in fact, when we think about his word, he is the meaning of his name and who he is. He's the son of exhortation. He's the man who finds the positive, and that's the way we ought to be. To not be so hard on people who have to endure some difficult situations. Whatever it was that John Mark had to endure, maybe it's easy for us, but it might not be easy for someone else. I don't know. Being young, experiencing a different culture. Have you ever experienced culture shock before, Brian? Has that ever hit you?
Not in a severe way.
Yeah.
I
I know some who have. We took a student with us one time on a mission trip, and several students from the school of preaching to Jamaica, and we were in some pretty backcountry difficult situations, and I remember one day he didn't even want to leave his room, and I went in and I said, called his name. I said, "Are you okay?" "Yeah, yeah." I said, "Are you sick?" "No, no." I said, "Well, why are you here? We're ready to go." He said, I just don't know. It just feels weird here. I don't." And he was going through culture shock, and so I basically, in a kind way, said, "You need to get up and go." Well, it wasn't quite so kind, but anyway, is that he had never experienced anything outside of where he had grown up in Central Texas, and so it's hard, when people are living in a totally different way than you are. It's a shock to our system. Well, sometimes we have to experience some of those things to grow and to develop, and we're going to make mistakes. Praise be to God for people like Barnabas who still see the good in us, and who, through God working in him, could redeem a bad situation and then make someone like him into something great. So I think a lot about that. And man, I could preach all day about that, brother. There's just But I think that's one of those lessons that we've got to, when we visit Cyprus, we have to talk about.
Well, and you put it so beautifully, and you put those two ideas together. Do you have the fortitude? And if the answer is no, well, it's not too late. I mean, John Mark didn't have the fortitude, yet still managed to push through that and ultimately be encouraged by another to do what God wants you to do. You and I don't do a ton of preaching, although that may be in some debate. But part of the reason we're doing this podcast is so that you can know more about the land of the Bible, but also the Bible message itself. And that is in part the Bible message, that you can be redeemed, you can be restored. And whether you're a Christian who feels like you're not progressing spiritually enough, or whether or not you're somebody who's just discovering what God wants for your life, what he wants is for you to turn and work for him and to be on his team. And when you do that, you can find purpose and hope and direction like never before. So if you're considering that, reach out to us at the podcast. And as always, thank you so much for listening today. John, do you have anything as a final word?
Oh, that's it, Brian. Thanks so much, though.
All right. And we will see you next time on the Bible Passages podcast. John and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Bible Passages podcast. One of the missions of Bible Passages is to deliver as much free Bible content to people as possible, but we can't do that without your support. First, you can like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast or on YouTube. Second, you can leave a comment on this video or this episode so that we know that you're listening. And third, if you feel compelled to give, you can do so at BiblePassages.net/give. Thank you so much for your support, and we'll see you in the next episode.